Good afternoon, and welcome to the AAJLJ's International Holocaust Remembrance Day program. It's an honor and a privilege to see so many of you here. We have three incredible panelists speaking with us today. We have Michael Bazyler, Dina Gold, and Phillip Weiner. January 27th marks the day in 1945 that Auschwitz, Nazi Germany's largest concentration and death camp, was liberated by Soviet troops. International Holocaust Remembrance Day is also a day to reaffirm that never again not only applies to the genocide and massive execution of Jewish people, but to devote renewed energy to preventing the growth of the beliefs, attitudes, racism, and distortion that allowed it to happen. We must acknowledge that the sentiments and beliefs that allowed the Holocaust to happen are still with us today. And if the last 2 to 5 years are any indication, they are rising. Why must we never forget the Holocaust? When we have programs like these, where most of the attorneys and scholars are so educated in this area, it's easy to take for granted that we all do remember the Holocaust, the slaughter of 6 million Jews and individuals from other groups with perceived racial biological inferiorities, including the Roma, disabled people, Soviet prisoners of war, and homosexuals. So I'd like to give you an idea based on a recent survey of the risk we face collectively of becoming a society that doesn't remember the Holocaust. In 2020, Gideon Taylor, president of the Conference on Jewish Material Claims Against Germany, also known as the Claims Conference, announced the release of the US Millennial Holocaust Knowledge and Awareness Survey. And this was the first ever 50-state survey on Holocaust knowledge among millennials and Gen Z. Here are some highlights. A shocking 11% said they believe that Jews themselves created or caused the Holocaust. Roughly 60% of respondents did not know or had no knowledge of the 6 million Jews that were murdered, according to the study. 48% could not name a single ghetto or camp. 56% could not identify the most notorious death camp, Auschwitz. Almost 1/3 of respondents had seen Nazi symbols or pro-Nazi propaganda posted in their own neighborhoods or in their social media feeds. But there's an upside. A consistent bright spot across all the survey findings is the desire for Holocaust education. 64% of all US millennials and Gen Z believe that Holocaust education should be compulsory in school. 80% of respondents believe that it's important to continue teaching about the Holocaust, in part so that it doesn't happen again. We all have the responsibility not just to remind each other, but to teach those who don't know. Our first speaker has made it his life mission to educate and galvanize generations of crusaders for justice. Professor Michael Bazyler is a foremost Holocaust scholar. He works tirelessly to demonstrate the extent to which contemporary law has a direct connection to the Holocaust. He's a leading authority on the use of American and European courts to address genocide and other historical wrongs. Professor Bazyler embraces the Holocaust as a paradigm, not just as a moment in history. He's a historian, but also a forward-thinking innovator. On a personal note, during my second year at Cardozo Law School, I took a wartime restitution seminar. One of our texts was Holocaust Justice, The Battle for Restitution in America's Courts by Michael Bazyler. That seminar has had a profound impact on my career and on my life. And that book occupies a very important place in my unfortunately shrinking physical library. Today, Professor Bazyler is going to share information on some of his current projects. Professor Bazyler, I turn the mic over to you.
Thank you very much. Can everybody hear me and see me? Yeah. Lisa, thank you so much for the very nice introduction. It's I really appreciate that. And knowing that you're someone that began looking at this subject of law and the Holocaust in law school at Cardozo and continues with passion, for this. As a professor, gives me a very warm spot in my heart. So thank you so much. I wanted to go ahead and focus during my brief remarks on start with January 27th, which, as Alyssa had mentioned, was the day of the liberation of the concentration camp Auschwitz. Specifically, it was the Red Army that reached Auschwitz first in Poland. And within the Red Army, it was the 16th Ukrainian Division of the Red Army. So it was Ukrainians fighting for the Soviet Union, both Jewish and non-Jewish, that reached the concentration camp gates at Auschwitz. And one of those individuals was actually a Red Army Ukrainian soldier who was Jewish. And when he entered through the gates and saw the horror and the hell in there, he began talking to some of the prisoners, and he could speak to them because he spoke Yiddish and they spoke Yiddish. One of the things that we can also, discuss about World War II and specifically Ukraine is there was a large number of perpetrators that were Ukrainians, either themselves committing atrocities against Jews, as horrible as the Nazis, or somehow being part of the machinery of destruction that the Nazi regime had done on Europe. But at the same time, there are individuals in Ukraine who also help Jews. And you might know about the fact that the State of Israel and its Holocaust Memory Center, Yad Vashem, collects what are called names and numbers of righteous among nations per country and ethnic origin. And these individuals who are recognized by the State of Israel as risking their lives in order to help Jews. And I was looking in preparation for this presentation, I looked at the latest list, and it indicates that from Ukraine, there are 2,691 Ukrainians, not Jewish, who helped rescue Jews. And the website for Yad Vashem says that this number is not necessarily the true number, but only reflects the cases that were made available to Yad Vashem and after they've done significant research. One of those, or two of those individuals that are mentioned in this list, and you can look them up, is the Bogancha family. I'll spell it for you, B-O-G-A-N-C-H-A, B-O-G-A-N-C-H-A, okay. And this was a young Ukrainian couple with children who their children went to school with two Jewish girls in the city of Kharkov. And when the two Jewish girls were not taken out and hid to be, by the Nazis to be shot outside of Kharkov, they made their way to the Bogancha family and asked for shelter. And the Boganchas hid them and actually saved them. These two young women ended up both coming to the United States, building long lives, and then made sure that the State of Israel recognized the Bogancha family. The reason I mention that because as the war in Ukraine is going on and Russia's invasion of Ukraine, the heirs of the Boganchas, the grandchildren, the grand-grandchildren, had to flee Kharkov from the Russian invasion and are now in Europe, specifically in Germany and in Austria. And that includes 3 generations, the children of Mr. and Mrs. Bogancha, the grandchildren, and the grand-grandchildren. When the war started in April, one of the things that I took the initiative is to bring on law students in order to go ahead and help Ukrainians fleeing the war. And one of those families that we help and are helping are the Bogancha's family. So I am pleased to report that Alex Bogancha, 18 years old, 2 weeks ago, arrived at Los Angeles International Airport, was greeted by a student group and actually a reporter and a photographer from the Los Angeles Times to tell the story. And he will be attending Santa Monica College on a scholarship. And his flight and his expenses were paid by one of the sons of the 2 Jewish girls who were saved by the Bogancia family. So you can see about the circle moving backwards, forwards, and the idea that we are helping each other. Every time I see Alex, I feel like I'm, helping out, continuing that tradition that is there. The organization that we formed in order to do this, we are calling it the Ukrainian Mothers and Children Transport. And there's specifically why we use the term transport, because we want to harken back to the kinder transport that you might have heard of, where in 1939, 10,000 Jewish children from Austria and Germany, occupied now by the Nazis, were allowed to leave, put on a train, and sent over to England, and their lives were saved. The parents had to basically just let them go. The parents, most of them perished, the children survived. And I thought, if we're going to go ahead and help the Ukrainians right now, that are fleeing the war, this is the opportunity in order to harken back to the Holocaust. And I can say that specifically for Alex Bogancia, the home that he's staying with is a home of one of the children whose mother was on that kinder transport. And we did not realize when we put out the call in Southern California who can help Alex Bogancia and house him while he's attending Santa Monica College. It would be this family that would come forward and want to go ahead and pay forward. So, the circle of righteous among nations continues among Jews, non-Jews. It's important to recognize that as atrocities occur in the world, that we talk about never again, but the never again happens again and again, that individuals who are bystanders take the road of the righteous and do help individuals out. And it is important to remember those and to instill the kind of morals and ethics in students of this generation, especially in law students, to go ahead and to recognize not just the perpetrators, not just the victims, but also the bystanders who became upstanders. Let me stop here. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Michael. I actually posted your article and the link to umactransport.org in the chat so people can take a look. So thank you so much. And hopefully people will have some questions in the end and maybe have a way to get in contact with you to see if there's a way to participate. So our next speaker is Dina Gold, and I am going to call on the AAJLJ VP, Rhonda Lees, a good friend of Dina's, who also introduced her to the organization, to introduce Dina.
Thank you, Alyssa. And I'm going to be referring to slides that we're going to be showing later. So Dina is a former BBC journalist who moved from London to Washington, D.C. in 2008. That's when she began writing her book. Slide 1, which we'll talk about later, is her book, Stolen Legacy, Nazi Theft and the Quest for Justice at Krausenstrasse 1718, Berlin, about a restitution claim that she launched immediately after the fall of the Berlin War. After publication, she toured with the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, speaking about restitution. She has also spoken by invitation in London, Germany, Australia, and New Zealand about the book. In addition, she has written 2 cover stories for B'nai B'rith magazine. The first is about the Nazi destruction of the Jewish fashion industry and how that shameful history has been buried. And just a month ago, she published a story on stolen silver, on the 1939 plunder of Jewish-owned silver, and how the Bavarian National Museum, over 80 years since acquiring several pieces of that silver, is finally trying to trace heirs and return these objects to them. And now, Dina, you will tell us your personal restitution story. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Rhonda. Well, I'm not a lawyer and I'm not an academic, but I do know about restitution. It all began with my grandmother, Nellie. Here we are together outside the British Museum in London. Nellie used to regale me with stories about her glamorous Berlin lifestyle before the Nazis came to power. She had married into a very prosperous family and lived with her husband and children, my mother being the oldest, in a grand villa in Wannsee. In 1933, they emigrated to what was then Palestine. When I knew her, she had very little money. But Nellie always dreamt of reclaiming a huge office building, which had been built by her father-in-law, my great-grandfather, as the headquarters of his international fur fashion company. Nellie believed that she was a legal inheritor. But the building was in East Berlin, 2 blocks from Checkpoint Charlie and beyond legal reach. My grandmother died in 1977, leaving no documents, no photos, not even an address of the building that she had told me so much about. I put her stories out of my mind and I got on with life. Then in 1989, the Berlin Wall fell. I thought back to what Nellie had told me. Had she been correct? My mother couldn't help. She knew nothing. So I began researching. In summer 1990, I found a 1920 edition of a Berlin business directory. Inside was an advertisement for H. Wolf. We can show that advert. Can you do that, Alyssa?
Should be there.
I don't see it.
Give us a moment, Dina. I apologize for.
Share screen. It's just
The next
showing.
slide.
Oh, it's the next slide.
The next slide. There we go.
Thank you.
Inside was an advertisement for H. Wolf, the family company, and crucially, an address, Krausenstrasse 1718. Was that the building that Nellie had told me about all those years ago? In December 1990, I flew to Berlin and took a taxi to Krausenstrasse. We drove into former East Berlin and stopped outside a huge building with a German flag. Next. A large brass plaque on the wall declared it was the Berlin outpost of the Federal Ministry of Transport, and someone took a photo of me. Then I marched in and I asked to see whoever was in charge. A man came to reception and I showed him the H. Wall advertisement and announced, "I've come to claim my family's building." And he laughed at me. So I told him that my family had once owned this building. I was bluffing. I had no evidence. But he ushered me in and went off to phone head office in Bonn. When he returned, he admitted it was known that the building was once owned by Jews, but no one knew if anyone had survived the war. So I told him my family's story. At the end, he said, "You must get this building back for your mother." Then I confessed that I had absolutely no documents to prove ownership. "Documents exist," he assured me. "You must go out and find them." But I feared that all paperwork would have been destroyed during the war. After all, Berlin had been heavily bombed. Well, I was in for some surprises. It was not long before I found a 1910 edition of a German architectural magazine with a photo of the building just after construction. 6 stories high, it has 2 inner courtyards and stretches back to the parallel street. And here is the back of the H. Wolf family building, and you can see the name clearly on the left-hand side. I found an H. Wolf Winter 1910 catalogue with some of the fashions that the company had produced. But what I really needed were documents to support a legal case for restitution. It was essential to prove that the Wolf family had once owned the building rather than just rented it, and that they'd lost it due to Nazi persecution. And it was also imperative to find out who the legal inheritors were. A key discovery was a copy in the land registry document charting the history of ownership. Next. In 1937, the Victoria Insurance Company had suddenly withdrawn the mortgage, but instead of putting the building up for auction to the highest bidder, had immediately sold it at below market value to the Reichsbahn, Hitler's railways. And attached was an incredible find. In the late 1940s, the East German authorities, functioning under the Soviet occupation forces, had added a memo in the land registry noting that the building had been taken from its Jewish owners and could not be sold until its status had been resolved. Translated, part of this document says, and I quote, "The Jewish private owner was forced to sell because of the political circumstances of the time. We request that you do not sell this property." So communist officials had recognized an injustice. The last legal hurdle was to show the line of inheritance. It was a laborious and time-consuming process to find birth, death, marriage certificates, and wills. But it had to be done. Crucially, it was vital to find the will of Nellie's mother-in-law, my great-grandmother, Lucy Wolf. The building had been in her name until her death. So, who were her heirs? I feared that no will written in 1932 could have survived. I was wrong. We found it in the Charlottenburg Court Archive. Nellie had been right. She was named as an inheritor, and so was my mother. Pursuing this legal case was an emotional roller coaster. Frustration at hardly any movement for months on end, and then moments of elation at the discovery of fresh information. While I researched, my mother needed lawyers to write legal letters and represent her. She was the claimant, not I. Luckily, the law firm that she found worked on a no-win, no-fee basis. 6 years after I started, the German government conceded that the 1937 so-called sale of the Wolf building happened on account of Nazi anti-Semitic laws. By 1996, the building housed the new German Federal Ministry of Transport, and the government wanted to keep it. No, go back. The finance ministry paid 20 million Deutschmarks, the equivalent in 1996 of about 14 million US dollars. And the money was shared between my mother and her siblings. Today, the building is part of the German Federal Ministry of Housing, Urban Development and Construction. The front entrance has been modernized, but the back is remarkably unchanged. The archway at the rear is the same, though the Wolf family name is no longer there. Now, this could be the end of the story, but it isn't quite. I wanted to have some public recognition of this history. In 2013, I wrote to the then Minister of Transport, whose office was inside the building, and I asked that a plaque be put on the wall at the main entrance, and he agreed, but nothing happened. Then, in May 2016, the BBC flew me to Berlin. Next slide. And they wanted to film the story of the restitution claim. Suddenly, officials couldn't do enough for me. And that's how, in July 2016, after waiting 2.5 years, I finally managed to get a plaque. And I wrote the inscription myself. I deliberately chose to have it in both English and German, and it reads, "The Wolf Building, Krausenstrasse 17, was constructed in 1909 as the headquarters of the H. Wolf Fur Company, one of Berlin's oldest Jewish fashion firms. During the Nazi era, ownership was forcibly transferred to the German railways. In 1996, after reunification, the German government purchased the building from the Wolf heirs. The building is designated an historic monument." So I hope if any of you go to Berlin, that you'll go and see it.
Thank you, Dina.
Thank you. Thanks so much, Dina. Such a great story. And I know you have a wonderful book, Stolen Legacy. And our last speaker is Phillip Weiner, and I'm going to have a colleague of his from the AAJLJ, Arthur Traldi, introduce him.
Thanks, Alyssa. I'm very honored to introduce Judge Weiner. He's an exceptional lawyer and humanitarian. He's been a judge in Cambodia and Bosnia-Herzegovina, adjudicating cases involving charges of war crimes, crimes against humanity, and genocide. A prosecutor in Boston and in The Hague, a professor at Boston College Law School, and a knight in Cambodia, among his many accolades. To take just two examples of his work on atrocity crime allegations, he was one of the lead prosecutors on the ICTY's Struger case, involving unlawful attacks targeting cultural property in the old city of Dubrovnik, and the Simic and others case involving the ethnic cleansing of the municipality of Bosanski Shamac. He has also trained judges and lawyers responsible for atrocity crime cases in Bosnia, Cambodia, and Ukraine, among other places, and advised families seeking the restitution of property taken from them in the Holocaust, like what Dina just talked about. In 2021, he led a coalition of war crimes lawyers calling for increased COVID vaccine assistance to Bosnia and Herzegovina, a project which was eventually successful. We're very excited to have him with us today, and with that, I'll turn it over to him.
Thank you. Kind introduction. I'm having some sort of problem with my video, so if my video starts to become staticky and jumping around, I'll just reboot it as we go along. I'd like to talk about the past year. It's been difficult for those of us who believe in the rule of law, in international justice, who also believe in never again. Each day when we've been watching the news, we're witnessing a major conflict in modern day Europe. We've watched bodies being removed from the streets, mass graves being uncovered, the mass destruction of residential and private property. We've learned of multiple rapes, mass looting, facilities being found that were used for torture. And we ask ourselves, was this predictable? Could these crimes have been prevented? The answer to both questions is yes. Since much of what is happening in Ukraine, we have seen previously in World War II and more recently in Bosnia. Were these atrocities expected? Yes, for the following reasons. First, just after the beginning of the conflict, Russia announced that it would be utilizing mercenaries. Ask yourselves, why would a country with such a large army as Russia need mercenaries? Well, we've actually seen what the Russian army is like, so we have a little bit more idea. But more importantly, what do we know about the history of mercenary units? In Bosnia in the 1990s, paramilitaries or mercenaries were used extensively. They did the dirty work that the armed forces didn't want to do, such as summary executions in the streets. They also raped, robbed, tortured, extorted civilians, committed mass murders, looted property, which is similar to what we've been hearing out of the town of Bucha. In Bosnia, these units included violent criminals who were just left out of prison and asked to fight. we're seeing the exact same situation in Bosnia. Now, we know about paramilitary units as Jews because they were used during the Holocaust. Some of the mass murders and atrocities that we mourn today were committed not by the Nazis, but rather by local militias, volunteer groups, national groups, or freedom fighters. These actions occurred in Latvia, Romania, Hungary, and Estonia. These militias had no problem killing Jews and stealing their property. These units have been used more recently, especially in Bosnia, and they've changed. They are no longer the poorly armed ragtag units of World War II. They're highly organized. They wear uniforms, use modern weapons, wear patches, and they even have tanks. Some have artillery. So whether you refer to these groups as in World War II, volunteers, militia fighters, or more recently as paramilitaries and mercenaries, these are very dangerous people. They murder for sport, and their cruelty has no bounds. As long as these units remain in the Ukraine, more atrocities will be committed. Next, we're hearing about mass rape in the Ukraine. Rape has occurred during wars for thousands of years. In fact, during a 3-month period in 1994 in Rwanda, between 250,000 and 500,000 women were raped. Imagine in a period of 90 days, hundreds of thousands of women being raped. It's almost impossible to believe. In Bosnia in the 1990s, there were also mass rapes of women, and even men were raped in the concentration camps. In Bosnia and Rwanda, however, the motivation for rape changed. Rape was used as a political and a military tactic. Why were men raped? It was perpetrated to humiliate them and take away their dignity, so then when they would be released or exchanged, they would never fight again. Women were raped as a tactic to ethnic cleanse an area and for ethnic revenge. Now, over the past 10 years, there's been a great deal more research and even memoirs from the Holocaust on government authorized or sanctioned rape and sexual slavery in the camps. So little by little, we're learning more about that. In fact, the Ghetto Fighters House is running as we speak. It started yesterday, a 4-part program on rape and sexual assault during the Holocaust. Now, this makes me wonder, are the rapes in the Ukraine due to a lack of discipline, or is it part of some sort of military strategy? We'll know probably later as we learn more information. Finally, we've seen massive destruction of civilian property, apartment buildings, homes, medical facilities, schools, train stations, theaters, and in some cases, practically whole cities destroyed. The laws of war are clear. You can shell military objectives, such as tanks or troops or artillery or munition factories, but you cannot shell civilians or civilian property. The failure to distinguish or discriminate between civilian and military objectives is prohibited, and it's a crime. The Russian military, however, has exhibited a pattern in Ukraine of not distinguishing between military objectives and civilians. And they've done this previously too. It's not just Ukraine. For example, during the first month of the Ukrainian conflict, just the first month alone, 43 hospitals and health facilities were shelled. Since 2014, Russia has shelled over 750 schools in southeastern Ukraine. And since 2011, in Syria, 350 medical facilities have been attacked. So the shelling of civilian property, just like the other crimes that I've mentioned, were also expected. Now, in this bleak situation, we're left with a number of questions, very serious questions. Will there be another genocide in the near future? Will our cry of never again be rendered useless? Will might make right be the new rule of doctrine? Although the situation is depressing and people are being killed and suffering on a daily basis, in the war crimes business, you must remain optimistic. You always must remain hopeful. And in fact, there are some reasons for hope. In this quest for justice, the United States, Great Britain, and the European Union have attorneys and investigators working tirelessly, investigating war crimes in Ukraine. These same countries have also joined to place sanctions on Russia. Even Switzerland has placed sanctions on Russia, which wasn't expected. Further, NATO is the most unified that it's been in years. Russia's plan to weaken NATO has failed. The International Criminal Court has investigators on the ground, and they're developing cases. And most recently, a number of academics and current and former diplomats are working to establish an international criminal tribunal to handle cases out of Ukraine. And it looks like that's going to be a reality. Finally, I'm very hopeful and proud because since the Nuremberg trials, Jews have played a major role in international war crime tribunals, whether serving as judges, as prosecutors such as Arthur Traldi, or attorneys. They've helped bring justice to the world. In fact, there are a number of Jews currently involved in the war crimes investigation in Ukraine, in training judges, in advising their government, and trying to bring justice there. So as frustrating as the situation is, all is not lost. Rather, on this day of remembrance, let us hope and pray that justice will come, that international justice will arrive, and we should hope for the day when our cry of never again will become a reality. Thank you.
Thank you, Philip. That's very sobering, but fortunately optimistic in the end. Thank you to the three of you. So I'd like to see if anybody has questions. So if you want to ask a question, I think the best way to go about this, well, you can either write in the chat, or if you'd like to raise your hand icon and I can unmute you. So I'll give people, okay. So we have a question from Stephen Ludson. Stephen, if you would like to speak to Dina, I will unmute you.
Oh, thank you.
Sure.
Let's see, I think I unmuted. Did I unmute from my side?
Yes.
Yes, hi. Well, Dean, I don't want to monopolize, but I was just totally moved by the timing of your story and your persistence, which is just, there's no limit, and it's just something that is an inspiration. And I just sent you along.
Yes, I'm just looking.
And I apologize. I didn't know. I didn't want to lose contact, and yet we don't have emails. And Michael and Philip, I also want to thank you for all the things that you've done and you're doing. And I've told the group before, and I'll tell you again. And there isn't a day that goes by where I can't get over the minor miracle that I was actually on the original Presidential Commission on the Holocaust and the first United States Holocaust Memorial Council. And at that time, I was the only child of a survivor on the group. And I gave a synopsis of my family story. But in any event, I just want to reach out to you, Dina, and hope that maybe we can connect. But
Sure.
The timing is extraordinary. But more importantly, it's the micro stories that make up the macro feeling that we all have. And that feeling for me was really captured recently by a book called Come to This Court and Cry by a woman named Linda Kinsler. And the reason that's interesting, if you will, and I think it was Philip that mentioned that there were that the local people killed, they collaborated with the Nazis, and he mentioned some countries. I just saw a brand new documentary called J'accuse
Oh, yes.
about Lithuania. So
I know Grant and I know Sylvia very, very well. We are.
Right. And so I want to, I guess in effect, I want to thank both of those women from us as children of survivors to have the courage to research the fact that they found out their grandfathers were collaborators. And
Right.
in the case of Linda, it was more extraordinary because she's Jewish on one side of her family. But again, I want to go to the macro. And the macro, I can tell you, as someone who was on the ground floor, so to speak, of building a museum, the tragedy of our circumstances today is the hope was when we built the museum that we would be able to tell the world why this shouldn't happen. And I will close with the line that Linda said, the opposite of forgetting, it may not be remembrance, it may be justice. And so as lawyers, that's something we're very sensitive to. And particularly Michael and Philip and Dina, you struck a blow for justice. So I just want to say thank you.
It's sad that I still get emails from loads of people asking me to help them. And I mean, I can give them general advice and places to go to and websites and so on, but I'm not a lawyer. So I can only tell them what I did. I can't really help them. But all over Eastern Europe, people are trying to get their properties back or their family property back. And it's really tough.
Well, let me tell you the good news. We did get the title back in 1993. And we have all the documentation. And I'm a lawyer. And I told Alyssa, I'm the one with the fool for the client because I represent myself. But I've made a lot of progress. But listening to your story, Dina, made me realize it's the next step that's sometimes the hardest, because you get to a certain point, you think you hit the wall, and then you find out you don't. And,
oh, yes.
And in a real sense, for me, inspiration has come from the story of the Holocaust survivors who went through unimaginable day-to-day horror, living every moment worrying about life or death. So I'll quote Bill Clinton, our problems are what he calls high-class problems. In other words, you know, this is tough, but.
Well, yes. And normally when I do an event, and I always stress right at the top that, you know, the Holocaust was a genocide and no one can bring back the dead. And that's the far worse story. And restitution is secondary. But I didn't have the time to say that today, but I think that's very important to bear in mind.
Thank you.
Before I go to Rhonda, I'm wondering, Michael, because obviously restitution is really your specialty, especially from a legal and academic perspective, if you could add anything that might be helpful.
Well, I want to be able to say something positive, but unfortunately, I'm not able to do so. Most countries in Eastern Europe have not done a very good job of restituting Jewish property. The country that is most at fault, and one that has not, the only one that has not passed the comprehensive restitution law with regard to property that was stolen by the communists and earlier by the Nazis, is Poland, which had the largest population of Jews, you know, in Europe prior to the war, and the second largest in Europe. We've been trying, and this is a number of us, both people inside the government, US government, outside the government, to try to get some kind of a comprehensive restitution law passed in Poland. It has not worked. And Dina, unlike your efforts, you know, with regard to Germany, Poland has really taken a very hard line in terms of recognizing, you know, any of the claims. And even though they say, well, you can go to court and you can file a claim and you can go through the Polish legal system, the reality is working with some of these individuals on the ground is almost none have been able to get any kind of compensation.
I know, and it's worse than that because Poland wants restitution now from Germany.
Yeah,
they see themselves wholly as the victims. I get people contacting me saying they're trying in Poland, and really I can't really help them. And it's the case, isn't it, that less than 20% of stolen Jewish property has been restituted or compensated for across Europe.
That's right.
Rhonda, please.
Wanted to make a comment similar to what Michael had talked about, which is, as a group, AAJLJ filed briefs with the Supreme Court in 2 cases. I think Hungary versus Simon and the US versus Phillips. So in other words, restitution cases based on comedy against both Germany and Hungary. And if I'm not mistaken, Arthur, please correct me, at least one of them was remanded, but on the whole, it is a very upward slog is the only word that I can think of, even though it's not a legal term. And I will say that state has sometimes intervened in these cases against our position. But since we never give up, if people would like to join us in other amicus briefs on this or other topics, please reach out. I'm going to reach out to you after today's conversation. And that is part of what AAJLJ does. Thank you. And also about Grant and Sylvia, they have spoken to our group before. And if you have not seen Grant's movie, it's amazing, an hour, and it's scary and amazing and very little bit optimistic.
I did it to myself. I have a question for Philip from Harvey Ryder. You mentioned that Russia's targeting civilians, their homes, hospitals are war crimes. Would its targeting of energy infrastructure also be considered a war crime, or could Russia claim it to be a military target?
That becomes a very, very difficult question. It's a great question. And there's not a lot of law on that. What you have here are energy facilities, and they're considered dual use purpose facilities. Actually, let me take a step back. Some of these facilities are used to support the army. Those you can target. Now you have others which are just supporting the civilian public. And the issue is, can you target them? And you come into an issue which is called dual use purpose. It's a civilian target. Where's my video? It's a civilian target which can also be converted quickly to military use. And as a result, those are considered military targets. Now, can you in fact target them? Are they in fact military targets if they've never been used as such? These are the issues that we really don't have a lot of law on. Where we do have law is when you have like an oil facility which is being used to send the oil for tanks and military facilities. Those are the easy ones. The infrastructure which has been strictly civilian, that becomes a very difficult issue. You have some of the laws of war experts and professors who would say any dual use objective or facility can be targeted. Others take the view, no, it cannot be targeted. And it's going to be interesting to see how the court deals with these issues. Whether we're going to have any actual decisions, who knows? The International Criminal Court, a lot of people are excited that they're going to take cases. They only take about 5-6 cases from a conflict. Maybe they'll double that and take 12, but overall it's going to be very limited. And that's why we really need an international tribunal. Domestically, Ukraine has tried a few cases during the war, and they're looking for an international criminal tribunal.
I have a couple more questions. First from Michael Siegel. Thank you all for a great presentation. Zelensky is making a strong push for war crimes prosecutions against the Russians. Do you think this will happen? Don't know who wants to take this. Maybe Phillip again, or Michael, or
President Zelensky has, right from the beginning, probably as early as March or April, called for an international war crimes tribunal for the crime of aggression. The only mistake I think they're making is they are limiting it to the crime of aggression. And it's moving ahead. It is progressing. However, there's a fight between the International Criminal Court, which wants to handle the cases, and the diplomats who are moving for an international court for the crime of aggression. They have come up with a theory of getting it. They know they can't get it through the Security Council. So they're going to get a vote, or they're going to look for a vote from the General Assembly at the UN, calling for the Secretary General to implement a court or establish a court. And that's the current plan. A similar process was done with the establishment of the Cambodian or the Khmer Rouge Tribunal. Thank you.
Now, I can add to that, to what Judge Weiner said. This is a process that's going to be taken on for many years. We have the tribunals, both at the international level and at the domestic level, and also mechanisms to the UN to create some kind of a special tribunal. We know what the crimes are. Those crimes were first found as crimes at the Nuremberg trial proceedings of Nazis. They were then recognized by the various ad hoc tribunals in the Yugoslavia and Rwanda and Cambodia that Judge Weiner was involved in. And they are the same crimes that are sought out in the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court. So the law is there. It's really the willingness to do so and the ability to do so. The United States Department of Justice has a special team of prosecutors headed by Eli Rosenbaum, who was the chief Nazi hunter for many, many years in the DOJ, who basically, I think, was convinced not to retire and to continue with this work. And so Eli is working with other prosecutors in the OJ, and he and Attorney General Merrick Garland actually went to Ukraine and spoke to the Prosecutor General of Ukraine and see how they can cooperate. Let me add another point, and this has to do with prosecution of Nazi war criminals and the analogy to today. Some of these perpetrators of atrocities in the Ukraine war are going to be found in other countries, either on vacation or emigrating over there to another country, including the United States. That's how many of the perpetrators came to the United States after the war, not revealing their horrid past and what they did. And there's a mechanism in the United States right now under federal law. If those individuals are found in the United States, they can not only be criminally prosecuted for immigration fraud by not telling their story, but actual for the crimes that is there. So we will see. The ultimate question is, will we ever see President Putin on the dock? And the answer is we don't know. There have been many dictators in recent years, like Slobodan Milosevic, like the situation in Sudan, where individuals were in power, seemed to be in power, and impervious to any kind of prosecution. And then they're overthrown and they're no longer in power. And they end themselves, in some dock in order to be tried. Saddam Hussein is also another example. So one doesn't know, will Putin die, peacefully in his bed, or will he end up, some jail cell somewhere in the world for the acts that he's committed.
thank you. We're going to take one more question from Enid Adler. She had a question regarding the International Criminal Court.
Yeah.
Probably
while some of it's been discussed already, I've been involved since Rome, and this is the 25th anniversary, as you know, of the court. You know, you can have too many tribunals. The reason for the crime of aggression tribunal is simply because that has not yet not enough under the jurisdiction of the ICC. It will be someday, eventually. That's being worked on. Yes, the court can only take so many cases. So the idea is to build up domestic courts so that they can take some of the other cases. So just comment on that. And then you were talking a lot about restitution when it came to the properties and things that were taken. How do you see that versus reparations, which the ICC is the only court to have that once somebody is convicted? Do you see similarities? Do you see differences? Or how do you see reparations? Because they're also being talked about in this country too, in terms of the, I don't know how you say this, Black Americans, I guess, those that came up from slavery.
Whoever would like to take that, that's all right.
I will leave the restitution to the experts, Dina and Michael. But with regard to two parts of the ICC and discussion of the prosecution, even if there is a tribunal established, as the professor was just talking about, the difficulties at times in establishing tribunals, and will they ever get an accused? Professor Bazyler mentioned Putin. Will they get any accused? If Putin is still in office, will he turn over any of the generals, any of the major figures who should be prosecuted? We don't know. Right now, the whole focus is on establishing a tribunal. With regard to domestic prosecution, I've been doing trainings, war crimes trainings for the judges in Ukraine, and they're coming up with a few problems that we haven't seen at the other tribunals. For example, at our first training, one of the trial judges got up and said, "I want to state publicly, I cannot be fair. And how could I be fair and impartial as a judge in any Russian case?" He said, "I go to court in the morning. In the afternoon, I usually have trials or hearings. In the afternoon, I usually work on verdicts, and then I go home and eat. Then I put my helmet on, a bulletproof vest, and I get an automatic weapon, and I go out and guard certain areas." He said, "My children are out fighting on the front lines. Our law clerks are out fighting on the front lines. All of our young attorneys are fighting." He said, "How can I be fair or objective in a case to any soldier who I believe has come into our country to enslave us?" And that was the feeling of not only that judge, but others. Then they had a second problem, which I hadn't seen before. They couldn't get any defense attorneys to represent the accused. Most of the defense attorneys are working for the government. When the war started, President Zelensky notified all attorneys, "We are going to need you. You're to assist the police in going to what we consider war crime scenes, shelling scenes, scenes where there could have been a mass grave, and you're to assist the police in the gathering of evidence." So it's cut down the number of attorneys who can, in fact, defend a suspect or an accused. And in addition, they don't want to be defending because they're out fighting on the front lines, trying to shoot at the people who they're then being asked to defend. It is a very difficult situation. One of the Justice magazines printed a picture that they thought was impressive of a training for 5 defense attorneys. Here we have one of the largest countries in Europe, and all they could find was 5 defense attorneys who were interested in conducting defense on behalf of Russian accused. So it was really a pathetic situation. So trying cases domestically is going to be very difficult.
So would they have to bring in lawyers from other places into their domestic courts that would be willing to do that?
You could do that, but then you have all sorts of translation issues, training
Right.
issues, learning the
Right.
legal codes. So,
Thank you. Thank you, Philip and Enid. I think that is about it. Thank you for staying a few extra minutes. Thank you so much to our speakers, to Michael, to Dina, to Philip. This has been really excellent. I hope everyone agrees. I will be sending a recording around to everyone afterwards. And also thank you to Rhonda and to Arthur of the AAJLJ, and please consider joining the AAJLJ and sharing your work and your stories with us. Thank you
And
to everybody. Oh,
We've
Good
got Kim,
job.
please.
Wonderful.
thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Let's
Bye. Bye.
Bye.